My name is Cary Meehan, and I've lived in the area for a long time. I'm a local historian with great interest in everything about Dunfanaghy, and particularly the workhouse here. And it's been open as a heritage centre for about 20 years, more than 20 years in fact. And downstairs we have a coffee shop, a lovely coffee shop on one side. We have a craft shop, and we have a series of exhibitions talking about life in the area. Dunfanaghy Workhouse was actually number 129 of the 130 workhouses that were built around Ireland, and each one of them was built in an area called a union, and the Dunfanaghy Union is a part of Donegal, whereby anybody within that union should be only one day's walk away from a workhouse. I mean, that's how all-encompassing and how organised the system was. Going into the workhouse was an absolute last resort, and there are lots of reports of people actually dying in the ditches outside the workhouse because they were so averse to actually committing themselves inside. However, nobody was forcibly taken there. People agreed to come, but it would have been a last resort. And one of the most tricky things about it was that it was the whole family or nothing. So if you had a family, say with 6 children and 2 parents, the whole family had to come in. And therefore, once you were in, there was no prospect, for example, of the man continuing to try and work or try to make a little bit of money in order for them to continue on their way. However, here you can see that the Dunfanaghy Workhouse, sometimes families came and stayed maybe just for one night, and they were actually using it as a way to get from one place to another, maybe to other members of family in another part of the country, which is an aspect of the workhouse that people wouldn't maybe know so much about. Perhaps one of the oldest and most significant exhibitions here is the story of wee Hannah, who was an inmate of the workhouse. And for her, it really tells you a lot about the workhouse, because she was, it was sort of a lifeline for her, but it was also a really horrible thing that she, it saved her from death, but she certainly didn't enjoy being here. She had a very rough time. Wee Hannah was born in this area in the 1830s, and when she was very young, her mother died, and her father married again and married a woman who she would certainly say was very bad to her. And she ended up being hired out and working in different farms, and eventually setting off on her own. And so she would have had a very hard life as a young woman in the 19th century and through the famine years. And she ended up in the workhouse on a number of occasions. Now, we know about her life because towards the end, she was taken in by a local woman, Mrs. Law, who provided her with a wee house and who wrote down her life story, which is just absolutely fascinating because it's in her own words. And that's the story that you hear when you go around the workhouse. So it kind of brings to life the best and worst of the workhouse. And we all know about the worst, but if it wasn't for the workhouse here, she definitely would say herself that she wouldn't have survived. So when she came into the workhouse, it would have been, times would have been very hard. Times were very hard outside the workhouse, but times were very hard inside in a different kind of way, because the workhouse would have been run in a very Victorian fashion, where it was really thought that cleanliness and order, lack of comfort and strict regime were really what would save people from poverty. And there was a bit of an idea at the time that poverty was really the result of people being lazy and having no discipline. So discipline would have been huge. And when people came into the workhouse, they would have been divided. Certainly on this side would have been the side where women were processed, men on the other side. And when families would have come in together, they would have been immediately segregated. And the women and children would have been on this side, and the men and the young men and boys would have been on the other side. Now, Hannah would have come into this, she would have immediately been put into a regime where you got up at 6 o'clock with a bell and you worked pretty much right through the day. And the women would have been washing and scrubbing and cleaning and cooking food, a very, very basic kind of diet, which for many people would have been a lifesaver after near starvation outside of the workhouse. But still, initially mainly potatoes, buttermilk, and gradually over time that was replaced by more oatmeal and yellow meal as the potato famine progressed and there weren't any potatoes anymore. One of the good things for her about coming into the workhouse was that they had a doctor here, and the doctor would have looked after her, and I think in the end given her a tonic which she would say saved her life. And she had that tonic and her health improved, and she left the workhouse again and went back on the road as a peddler, selling combs and buttons and little bits of this and that. So hard life outside, hard life inside. But in the end, when Mrs. Law took her in and they built a little one-room cottage for her, people brought furniture and they had a little party, and she was, as she would say herself, happy at last in her own wee corner.